Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Now it's time for our new segment focusing on Latin American politics with Luis Francisco Rangel. Luis is a member of the Venezuelan diaspora, a Venezuelan musician based here in Austin who's joining the show. Thank you very much, Luis, for coming on.
Thanks, Brianna. Appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to have you back on. So I'm looking at a few different news articles. Today, I think we want to focus on Venezuela in particular. There is a lot going on with regard to the Venezuelan economy. So I looked at 3 articles from Telesur this particular week. We are looking at an article titled Venezuela to Relaunch Petro-Caribe Program in 2020. Another article titled The UN Accepts Credentials of Venezuela's Legitimate Government. And then another about Russian economic cooperation, which is titled Russia and Venezuela Sign Agricultural Cooperation Agreement. So what do you make of sort of the turn, I think, in Venezuela's economy over essentially the past year? It's certainly been quite a year for Venezuela.
Yes, it has. Things have been, getting better and better in spite of anything that you might hear in the mainstream news. The Petro-Caribe program is,
It's back.
It's back, and it's part of it is a result of Venezuela having actually creating more and more oil. The production of oil has been rising.
Yeah, it's been an interesting phenomenon where I was talking to Dan Kovalik recently, who was basically saying that kind of one of the things that he didn't think was covered enough was that Venezuela actually had a record oil production. This is in the face of U.S. sanctions that have devastated the country, that have essentially led from a sort of a sanctions regime to an almost complete economic blockade. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that, what the effects of the blockade have been and what programs they've targeted.
Well, the blockade has been just targeting, hygiene products and medicine and things like that. So if you talk to people, they'll say that you can't find things like toilet paper or basic medicines, which is really strange because you still find other paper products. You don't find toilet paper, but you find, any other type of paper product in the stores. And, it hasn't been super effective because the Venezuelan government has implemented a lot of programs to take care of its own needs, and they've been quite effective at that. In spite of these types of blockades and sanctions, they've been able to maintain steady production and rising production.
The question of specific commodities being targeted is interesting because a lot of those commodities, the reason we face shortages is largely because of the kind of hoarding of these various different private industries. That was something that kind of predated the latest round, or at least the Trump administration sanctions. Obviously, sanctions go all the way back to, I think, 2014 against Venezuela.
Obama imposed a number of sanctions as well.
Yeah. And so there's been this kind of shift, initially focusing on kind of different, more different economic programs like sanctioning Venezuelan oil and whatnot. The most horrific of the sanctions were actually those, the most that anyone would just look at and say this is an unjust form of sanctions would be, of course, the sanctions against the CLAP program.
That's right. Yeah, the CLAP program. Basic food necessities. This is something that is, a typical capitalist tactic of creating false crises and false shortages, and then blaming it on the government so that they can then have a sort of validity to install their own puppet government, their own puppet politicians. So the CLAP program is an initiative that Maduro started in 2016, I believe. Where the government sends representatives to form committees in different communities around Venezuela, and the committees are responsible for gathering members of these communities and putting them basically in charge of what their needs are, how their needs need to be met, and how they're going to go about doing that. and it has been largely successful in creating these committees and implementing these sorts of basic necessities so that the people of Venezuela can be self-sufficient and move forward in spite of all these sanctions and whatnot. And this has been largely successful in spite of the fact that the U.S. has been involved in limiting any sort of minimal imports that could be sent to Venezuela.
Yeah, the U.S., among other products, has blocked all shipment of insulin into Venezuela and other medical necessities. The other part of that CLAP program is really the key to it is the providing of these packages that are once or twice. I forget if it's once per month or twice per month. There's essentially a sort of staple food, such as different. I think it's rice. There's like chicken. There's a couple other things.
Cereal.
Yeah. So basically, in this point where U.S. economic sanctions have killed 40,000 Venezuelans, according to the Organization of Economic Policy Research, Center for Economic Policy Research, rather. In this point where these economic sanctions have killed 40,000 Venezuelans, the CLAT program has been sort of utilized to essentially to keep people alive, to provide for the survival of vast numbers of people. At the same time, there's also the massive construction programs going on where the Venezuelan government has stepped in to essentially provide more or less free housing. Now, both the housing that they're providing and the food programs, the CLAT programs, essentially they charge a little bit of money, but it's usually cents per package, like just a matter of a few cents per package or whatnot, just to sort of involve a very like nominal economic transaction there. But it's essentially providing food, providing housing at a time where the U.S. is preventing any food and any medicine from getting into the country. And it's doing so in a way that even many of the most kind of anti-Chavista people, the people who may not necessarily be for Maduro, for the PSUV, still have to acknowledge, I think, the merits of this program and are still furious at the U.S. for preventing this from getting into their country, which is, I think, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, this still falls under the category of socialism is bad because welfare state creates dependence and laziness and all that stuff. But that sort of thing exists even in the U.S. It's just that it's not about basic necessities. When it's about housing and food, and when it goes to people who actually need housing and food, suddenly it's bad for some reason. But no, again, like you said, this is about survival. Of course, people need housing and food.
Yeah, and they're recognized as human rights under the United Nations as well. Speaking of the United Nations, I'd like to get into a little bit of this next one, which is that the UN accepts credentials of Venezuela's legitimate government. Again, from Telesur. Just going to read a little bit of the first lines here. The General Assembly of the United Nations accepted the credentials of the Bolivarian government chaired by Nicolas Maduro, validating him as the only representative of Venezuela before the multilateral organization. So this comes at a time of struggle. Obviously, Venezuela faced a far right-wing coup attempt by essentially the proto-fascist Juan Guaido and other kind of forces who were essentially burning people alive in the streets. Pretty horrifying stuff that went on in 2017 there. And so after that, kind of the coup attempt that happened earlier this year, in addition to targeted sanctions, really tried to throw into crisis the legitimacy of the Maduro government, the PSUV and whatnot. But it seems that by recognizing the Maduro administration as a legitimate government of the country that is recognized by this international law, it's the final nail in the coffin to this Guaido coup. This attempted U.S.-backed Guaido coup is no longer even recognized by legitimate. I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of how that struggle played out throughout the course of the year.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this decision by the UN really just makes it almost impossible for anyone to argue that Maduro is not the legitimate president. So this all started a few years ago when Maduro formed what is now known as the Constituent Assembly in order to as an attempt to replace a National Assembly, which had become just very corrupt, filled with rich fascist that just didn't care about serving the people. So he very constitutionally, I should say, created a constituent assembly made of people, working class people who would actually serve the people of Venezuela. The opposition didn't like this, obviously, and has been trying to use this as a way to delegitimize Maduro as a president. And the coup attempt earlier this year was kind of the climax of this, kind of the epitome of their attempts at overthrowing Maduro. They decided that the constitution that they themselves claim is invalid allowed them to say that Maduro is incapable of fulfilling the role as president, and therefore they have a right to install their guy, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president. Of course, when that happened, when they made this announcement, Trump, Pence, all these right-wing leaders around the Western world jumped at that opportunity and said, yes, of course, he is the legitimate president of Venezuela. But unfortunately, based on laws that have been in effect for years, this is absolutely not the case. First of all, the article that the opposition was referring to in order to somewhat legitimize their claims did not say that that they could do what they did, because it explicitly said that the only way that they could replace the president with someone else is if the president is physically incapable of fulfilling the role as president, which was not the case. They just didn't like his ideology.
Yeah, and then of course, if that were the case, if for whatever reason Nicolas Maduro were no longer able to fulfill his role as president, the next person in line, according to this particular article of the Constitution, the next person who would have fulfilled that role would be Delcy Rodriguez.
That's right. Delcy Rodriguez would be the next in line, and so this guy Juan Guaido didn't have any sort of claim to the position of president. But of course, that's all they had. They had very little cards to play.
You know, this gets to also what people consider to the quote unquote international community to be. We got the idea from kind of the corporate media, from the U.S. mainstream media, that overwhelmingly the quote unquote international community was recognizing Juan Guaido, who 80% of Venezuelans had never heard of at the time of his announcing as president. They literally 80% of Venezuelans had no idea who he was. But we got this idea that the international community was recognizing Juan Guaido as the legitimate president. But if you look at the actual map of the countries that recognized Juan Guaido, it was basically the U.S., parts of the European Union, other U.S. aligned, essentially like these, what we would call imperialist countries, and countries that were essentially right-wing puppet states of the U.S. Through the mechanism of the OAS, the Organization of American States. But by and large, it never amounted to more than, I think, 50 or so countries recognizing Guaido, which, of course, is much, much less than 50% of the countries in the world. The vast majority of countries in the world continued to recognize the Maduro administration. Opposition forces here never were able to provide any evidence for there being any sort of voter fraud. They asserted it because they didn't win, but they could never provide any evidence to show that there was any sort of voter fraud. And so this, I think, as we were talking about, was really the end in many ways of the Juan Guaido's claim to any sort of legitimacy whatsoever outside of essentially being backed by the United States. It's the U.S. that is standing alone as usual with regard to international law. The U.S. continues to flaunt it here. So we have about 30 seconds left. Is there anything else you'd like to generally kind of comment on as regard to like the prospects of Venezuela as we go into the new year? Like what do you see? Where do you see Venezuela's economy going and its society going?
Well, on a personal note, speaking with my family who's still living there, they were going through some hard times there for a while, but honestly, every time I talk to them now, they say that things are starting to normalize. Things are starting to get better, easier. They feel like they can breathe again, things like that. So I think the prospects are really good. I think the future of Venezuela is actually looking pretty bright.
That's a great place to leave it. We're going to wrap up there. We were joined by Luis Francisco Rangel, who's a member of the Venezuelan diaspora, as well as an Austin-based musician. Thank you very much for joining the show once again.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now it's time for our returning segment, Socialism 101, going over the basics of socialist, political, social, and economic theory. We are going to be joined for this segment now by Winn Ellinger, who is an Austin-based musician and cultural worker. Thank you very much, Winn, for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a while since I've been on. I'm happy to be back.
For our last kind of segment, when we discussed this with Derek Ford a while back, we discussed basically sort of Marxism generally. What is Marxism? What is capitalism? And sort of what was the intervention that Marx made? So for this segment, I'd like to sort of go a little bit deeper into sort of what many people consider to be the next major step forward, or the next major stage of Marxism, which is to say Leninism, and sort of the interventions that Lenin made with regard to not only the social and economic theories of what is capitalism, but when Lenin made those sort of interventions as to like how one brings about a socialist revolution and what sort of the gains there were. So yeah, if you can just give us a rundown, like basically like what kind of Lenin brought to the table here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in order to really understand the significance of what Lenin really did bring to the table, we're going to need to turn back the clock just a little bit before 1917. So let's go back. We're going to be going back to just a little bit before World War I. So pre-Russian Revolution, the general population of Russia was very poor peasants, and any uprisings demanding like food or rights were brutally suppressed by supporters of the Tsarist regime at the time. And so World War I began in 1914, and so the Tsarist Russia sided with England and France and a few other Western imperialist countries because they were initially promised some kind of a domination of like the Central East Asian subcontinent as, kind of material conquest, I guess. And so initially fueled by national pride, and many soldiers went to the World War I war theater, fueled by that national pride and part chauvinism. World War II quickly turned into an absolute disaster for the Russian people. Millions dead, most of the resources directed towards the war, food shortages, and widespread famine. And so eventually 1917 comes along. And so then we have what is frequently referred to as the February Revolution. There was a strike by women workers on Women's Day. I'm blanking on the exact name of it. It's, Working Women's Day.
International Working Women's Day.
There we
go.
Yeah. And so there were massive protests that grew over a period of 5 days. And by the end of those 5 days, the Tsar was overthrown. And so after that whole thing happened in so what was referred to as the February Revolution, there was the next few months that brought together that culminated with what was referred to as the October Revolution. And so between February and October, there were multiple political parties, including the Mensheviks, which were another party that were different than Lenin's Bolshevik party. And so a few political parties, including the Mensheviks, went to the capitalists of Russia, and that they argued that Russia would need to develop capitalism a bit more in order to actually get to socialism. Obviously, the Bolsheviks disagreed with that. And then one of Lenin's key things, I think, was that he argued that there would need to be another revolution, essentially. And so that this was the April Theses. And so this was given at a really decisive moment in the aftermath of the February Revolution. And so this whole thesis was to give a political orientation to the Bolshevik Party. And so they were to lead the working class to another revolution. So Lenin argued that the working class couldn't remain subordinate to the capitalist class and that they needed a second socialist revolution. So the revolution that they had in February was to overthrow the feudalists, to overthrow the Tsar, and they were like, okay, well, we don't need to sit around and wait for capitalism to develop for X amount of years while all of us workers are still starving and everything. And so we need to have another one so that we can directly take control of power. So something I think that Marx predicted was that there were going to be these socialist uprisings in places where capitalism was more deeply entrenched. Russia didn't exactly have that. And so the fact that they had these uprisings within Russia when they were still kind of like
essentially a feudalist society.
Yeah.
Russia, for the most part, even though it was an imperial power, the economic basis was still primarily feudalism. So there was like the peasant relations of land in rural areas and whatnot.
Right. And so given that was still the case, the essentially, Lenin was just like, all right, so we're going to push the fast forward button on this whole process. And so we need to actually, skip ahead, I guess, into actually declaring and overthrowing the capitalist class as well, not just the feudal ruling class.
Up until that point, the kind of Marxist theory was that revolutions would happen in quote unquote the most advanced capitalist countries, where capitalism itself was the most heavily, was the most heavily kind of a concentrated form of production. So the idea being that you bring enough of the what's called the proletariat, that is the urban working class that has nothing to sell but their labor, that has no land, that has no property, etc. And at some point, you proletarianize enough people and it reaches a tipping point. So the Russian Revolution came as a real surprise. And it was, because Russia was not one of the more advanced capitalist countries. It had a capitalist mode of relations, but the primary mode was that feudalist mode of relation. And so much of Lenin's own work was in sort of managing those contradictions of trying to build a socialist society, which was, at least up until that point, theorized to having in sort of a way where it would be built on top of the capitalist society, where so much of those means of productions were already centralized and whatnot. And instead, Lenin found himself through essentially, brilliant political maneuvering, brilliant kind of alliances, and also being able to call the bluffs of the Mensheviks, the sort of the quote unquote social democrat side of that, which was still essentially aligned with the Russian capitalist, being able to sort of manage all of those contradictions and bring about a essentially socialist state that had to then sort of manage essentially a feudalist society.
Right.
And after World War I, 90% of Russian agriculture and industry was completely devastated. So they are operating on 10%. And so much of the kind of Leninist way of going about securing enough food, securing enough industry in order to be able to survive, not just the famines that were happening because of that destruction of the World War, but also because of the counterattacks that were happening. 14 different capitalist countries attacked Russia within the first couple of years after the Russian Revolution. So much of Lenin's own kind of strategizing was, how do we develop that economic basis, in a way where, we're having to like skip these kind of steps in sort of this such imperfect society. I'd like to turn to the Leninist orientation, though, which I think is real important, toward imperialism, because Lenin was writing at a time where there were multiple imperial powers. At this point in history, there has, or at this kind of point in 2019, there's kind of only a unipolar world. That's changing to some degree, but the fact that there were these multiple imperial powers actually provided these different socialists, these different Marxist revolutionaries a chance to sort of, not exploit in sort of a sinister way, but to sort of reveal how these imperial operations did not benefit the working class in ways that allowed for a revolution. So yeah, maybe you can talk about just generally how does Leninism kind of view imperialism?
Right. So in terms of I wanted to get to the whole like a unipolar world order thing first. So after the Soviet Union was fully established in 1917, the development of the material conditions in the Soviet Union eventually led it to being one of the two main centers of world power, competing with the United States following World War II, because most of Europe had become kind of junior partners to the U.S. Relationship and all that. And so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, though, in the early 1990s, there was just that one world power left. And so in 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, who was then the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Policy, supervised this very strategic document for the post-Cold War world. And basically, it was just openly proclaiming the need for unquestioned U.S. hegemony. And so that's the main kind of like circumstance that we find ourselves in, to this day. As far as Lenin would view imperialism, though, we do need to consider a couple different things. First of all, what actually is imperialism and what is it trying to accomplish? And so imperialism, or to just read the title of one of Lenin's many publications, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And so the Soviet Union was founded excuse me, the Soviet Union, in addition to communist China, was founded on the principles of being not a capitalist, being communist. And the United States wasn't founded in terms of like explicitly like, yes, we are going to be a capitalist country, but that's just the way that it developed due to the property relations inside the United States because of the effects of colonization and everything like that.
Well, I think the U.S. The quote unquote founding fathers, those that led the slave owners revolt, I think they were very clear about what sort of society they wanted. I mean, essentially, the U.S. was founded on like pure capitalist relations, but you can't really put that in your foundational constitutional document. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we're a slave owners republic that seeks the exploitation of our working class.
Right.
Doesn't read that well in a constitution, so they kind of framed it in terms of quote unquote property rights and whatnot.
Yeah.
There are different forms of imperialism that predate capitalism, but when we're talking about the capitalist form of imperialism, how does a capitalist state form an empire? I think it's important for us to understand that, like, essentially, capitalism in its formation of an empire is its exportation of the absolute most horrifying conditions to essentially what we would call either the global south or the imperial periphery, essentially to sort of prop up some form of a welfare state or some like form of small material comfort for the workers, to prevent the workers from rising up, to essentially prevent that socialist revolution from happening in the imperial core. The imperialists essentially decide to export their worst forms of exploitation and essentially to capture, instead of just monopolizing sort of national markets, to monopolize global markets in order to do that. Because, for various reasons, capitalism is not as profitable.
Ironically.
Capitalism is not as profitable as people think it is. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall is something that Marx put very eloquently. And so imperialism is just sort of I don't want to say natural, but it's an outgrowth of capitalism that allowed for essentially this extension of a capitalist project. The scramble for Africa happened kind of on the heels of major revolutionary moment in 1848. And so then the scramble for Africa happened not soon afterward. The sort of intensification of the colonial project happened afterward in ways I'd like to get into on a future episode. But, sort of Lenin, in recognizing these particular trends, was able to sort of respond more effectively to it in I think many ways. So yeah, we have a couple minutes left. Is there anything else you'd like to sort of add in our last minute or two?
What I would like to say is that I would hope that people listening to segments like this really do understand how and like what imperialism really is. Just because I don't think there is a growing consciousness about capitalism and about imperialism, not just inside, the United States, but of course all over the world, in the global south, the imperial periphery, however we want to say it. Of course, people in, the imperial periphery have, I would venture a guess to say that they understand how capitalism and imperialism works, because they are on the receiving end, as you said, of like the very worst exploitation of it. And so, now, we need to make sure that people are actually more aware of what this whole thing looks like. Just because if there's going to be any stop to it, people need to know about it.
We're going to wrap up there. We were joined for this segment by Winn Ellinger, who's an Austin-based cultural worker and musician. Thank you very much, Winn, for coming back on the show.
Absolutely.
You're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. A little while back, I did essentially an entire series on a different global protests against neoliberalism. There were a couple protest movements I did not cover, one of which was Hong Kong, because the class character is so much different within the so-called Hong Kong protest movement, which is essentially, according to many observers, including myself, appears to absolutely be a U.S. right-wing regime change operation. So I'd like to, for those Americans who are sort of following this and have seen this as a quote unquote pro-democracy movement, which is the way it's always framed within U.S. corporate media and sadly much of a U.S. so-called independent media. I'd like to sort of get at the heart of what it is that's actually been going on in Hong Kong from sort of an anti-imperialist perspective. So to talk about all this, we are joined by Carl Zha, who's the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Thank you very much, Carl, for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so I originally kind of heard your discussion with the Moderate Rebels podcast with the Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, where you really broke down a lot of that. I definitely, for time's sake, I think people can go to that particular link. I'll provide a link to that so that people can get kind of a more detailed information, a detailed kind of explanation of the Hong Kong situation. But I'd like to rehash some of that here. Can you generally explain how the Hong Kong protests have unfolded, starting with the at this point infamous quote unquote extradition bill, and sort of how that became essentially a right wing kind of regime change operation?
Yeah, so the Hong Kong protest started as a protest against the extradition bill that Hong Kong government was trying to pass through its legislature. It came about because a Hong Kong couple went over to Taiwan, where the guy murdered his pregnant girlfriend, dumped her body at a remote train station, took her money and fled back to Hong Kong. And because of particularity of the Hong Kong law, he cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed outside of Hong Kong. So, only in Taiwan, where the murder took place, he could stand trial. But there is no formal extradition treaty between Taiwan and Hong Kong, which is also an artifact of the British colonial rule in Hong Kong. As we know, Hong Kong has been a British colony ever since the Opium War, when Britain forcibly took Hong Kong from China. And after 1997, the territory was handed back over to China, but under the one country, two system formulation, which means Hong Kong get to keep its separate laws, which mostly inherited from the British colonial era. And during the British rule, Hong Kong actually have extradition treaty with much of the rest of the world, including United States. And that's one reason when Edward Snowden fled to Hong Kong, he did not want it to stay because he was afraid that he might be extradited by Hong Kong government to United States upon U.S. request. But what Hong Kong does not have is an extradition treaty with either mainland China or Taiwan. And this law was supposed to address that issue, using this event, this particular gruesome murder. But because Hong Kong, since 1997, Hong Kong is officially a territory of People's Republic of China, and PRC does claim jurisdiction over Taiwan. So Hong Kong government, even though it's an autonomous administration under the PRC umbrella, it can't just do a separate extradition treaty with Taiwan only, right? So it tries to have extradition treaty law passed with all three Chinese territories. So that's mainland China, Taiwan, and Macau. And that sparked a huge protest. And I want to point out that this extradition treaty is really just a trigger. There's a lot of underlying issues that cause the Hong Kong protests. Some of the concern legitimate, because Hong Kong is one of the highest have the highest inequality Gini index in the world. Because Hong Kong is often touted as the model of free market capitalism, right? What in reality, Hong Kong economy is dominated by a group of oligarchs who just totally control the Hong Kong real estate, which has been artificially inflated sky high and inflict a high cost on the middle class and working class people in Hong Kong. So there's already a lot of discontent in Hong Kong itself against the current conditions, which was brought about by globalization plus neoliberalism. But at the same time, Hong Kong has other conditions that's particular to its local setting, because Hong Kong started as an immigrant city. When the British first came, it was just a collection of fishermen's village, and as time progress, a stream of refugees start to come to Hong Kong from mainland China, either escaping Japanese invasion or Chinese civil war. And especially after the communists took power in mainland China, there have been wave of refugees going to Hong Kong. So from the very beginning, Hong Kong, many people in Hong Kong, have that kind of are raised in that kind of atmosphere of anti-communism, right? There's a lot of prejudice against the mainland, and sometimes that prejudice extends to even the mainland Chinese people, and there's a lot of anxiety after 1997 handover to China. That the biggest fear that is that the Hong Kong people fear that they will just become another city, another Chinese city. This is actually a sentiment echoed by a lot of Hong Kong protesters. They fear they will just become another Chinese city, right? Because Hong Kong did have its colonial history for over 100 years, and it's a very cosmopolitan city. It's very quite easy to travel. As a U.S. citizen, you can go to Hong Kong without a visa. You can get 30 days stay, whatever, and many expats actually make Hong Kong its home. And that's another point I'd like to make is in many of these so-called research, Hong Kong often listed as ranking number one in economic freedom, and by I think Freedom House or some other publication listed Hong Kong as one of the free territory in the world. So keep that in mind when you read about rhetorics about China oppression in Hong Kong and how like Hong Kong is suffering under the Chinese boot. Because after 1997, largely China has left Hong Kong alone to its own administration. But with side effect is that the Hong Kong business elite, which is oligarch, came to dominate much of the Hong Kong politics, and that's one of the reasons why some Hong Kong protesters also felt kind of helpless and voiceless, and that also led to the protests. So there's some legitimate concerns that led to the protests. Of course, CIA did not motivate hundreds of thousands of people to take on the street. So there are legitimate concerns, but it does not mean that CIA, was totally hands off. Because as often happens, public, CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically a CIA front, often capitalize unpopular grievances in the countries that U.S. does not like, and then to help foment further unrest. And this is the case we can see in Hong Kong. In fact, that the National Endowment for Democracy has plowed about $29 million since 2014 into Hong Kong and China region.
First of all, I think the idea of the U.S. through the so-called National Endowment for Democracy is pouring money into Hong Kong, various Hong Kong movements, especially kind of the more right-wing separatist movements. I mean, if China were doing anything similar to that to the U.S., it would be the only thing that the media ever talked about. If, for instance, China were funding any social movement, the Tea Party or Black Lives Matter, or going back a little farther, Occupy Wall Street. If China were funneling money into any social movement in the U.S. to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars like that, it would be the only thing the U.S. media would ever talk about, and it would absolutely spark World War III. But the U.S. does it, and it's just because the U.S. is so suddenly concerned for democracy.
Yeah, and it's pushed by now U.S. Congress just rushed through the Hong Kong Human Rights and Freedom Act, which it was sponsored by Marco Rubio, who we know
famous champion of human rights, Marco Rubio. Yeah,
the freedom-loving Marco Rubio, and the Hong Kong, like the and also the face of Hong Kong protests, the media darlings, Joshua Wong and Denise Ho, they were trained by the Oslo Freedom Forum. There was actually a BBC documentary back in 2014 when there was another protest called the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong. They actually specifically talk about how Oslo Freedom Forum trains activists in Hong Kong. The clip is a classic because the BBC reporter actually said, regime change is a serious business. You have to get organized. And to organize activists, this is where they train. And they have a clip with Joshua Wong in the interview. And so this the groundwork has been laid, a while back, a few years back, and this is another reason why in the Western media we often hear very one-sided coverage of the Hong Kong protest. Right? It's posed as a very simple narrative of David versus Goliath, the brave Hong Kong protesters versus the big bad authoritarian China that's hell-bending on crushing freedom of Hong Kong, right? I mean, that's not really what's going on here. And the protest that the trigger for the protest, the extradition bill, was actually suspended back in June after the first big peaceful protest, but that apparently was not enough because the protests actually escalated in violence. A group of protesters broke into the Hong Kong legislature building, totally vandalized it, and then from there on, the violence just keep on escalated. There was a protester even wrote a piece in New York Times called Hong Kong protester tactic, how to get the police to hit you. And they talk about this so-called marginal violence theory, that how to aggressively using non-violent means to push the cops and push the government to overreact. And once they do, you can win 1 million people on your side. And they are following that tactic to the T. I mean, it's just, what we see here, we saw in U.S., we saw on TV, Hong Kong police fire tear gas, and employing the water guns, whatever. But we don't see what happens before that. We don't see the Molotov cocktails being tossed onto the busy traffic to stop the cars. The attempt to block traffic.
There are so many legitimate economic concerns that the people in Hong Kong could be protesting about. If they were concerned with the massive level of economic inequality that we're talking about, the fact that Hong Kong has a fairly large percentage of billionaires, but then this massive impoverishment and this massive monopolization of real estate, that would be a point where it would really be a people's protest that could arise into a people's protest, which would essentially be for a socialist system that would allow the nationalization of real estate, that would allow sort of government controls over this pricing, this wage, et cetera, that could better the conditions of the people. But instead, we're seeing the exact opposite of that, in that there are basically no sort of economic demands made by the protesters.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if they were protesting about the policies that leads to the massive inequality. I mean, there are people who literally live in cages in Hong Kong, and there were 1.4 million people in Hong Kong that live under poverty line. I mean, there's a massive economic inequality within the city. But when you ask a protester, when they're being interviewed by the international media, all of them said this is not about economics. We care about the politics. We care about freedom. We care about democracy. Okay, well, let's talk about that. I mean, their goal for their initial goal for resigning the extradition bill actually was achieved. The Hong Kong government initially suspended the bill in June, and then in July, the Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam repeated that the bill is basically dead. But the violence went on. So by September, Hong Kong government officially withdrawn the bill completely. Yet the violence just keep on escalating, right? Because the demand just keep on growing. And it looks to me, it's not really about the protesting the bill, the withdrawal of the extradition bill anymore. It's just to keep the violence, keep the chaos, keep the instability. And the purpose is more like destabilize Hong Kong.
I think it's three of the demands out of the 5 major demands that Joshua Wong had put forth are demands related to the violence itself. So it's like essentially at this point, those who are left, because again, it started out as a massive protest. It's much smaller at this point. It's not drawing the hundreds of thousands, but those who are protesting now, they're essentially at this point rioting to demand that their riots not be called riots. Is one of the 5 demands.
Yeah, and they demand amnesty for, release all the protesters, including all the violent protesters, right? And the breakup of right now, the Hong Kong protest is basically have a couple components. They're referred to in the Western media as so-called leaderless movement, right? Which what really means is no one can, take responsibility for what's happening. But they all agree. All the protesters, including the public face like Joshua Wong, Dennis Ho, all agree not to condemn the violence by the protesters. They made a pact. So what you have is massive the peaceful protesters who are in the majority, but who don't participate in the violence, but they don't condemn the ones who do perform the violence. But then there's like several thousands of so-called the frontline protesters. These people are just basically rioters. They engage in burning down the Hong Kong metro station, attack government buildings, attack the police barracks, and including beating up people who disagree with them on the streets. These people have a free reign, and in this kind of leaderless movement setup, what happened is a more radicalized, the more radical faction end up taking control, because the so-called moderates really have no control over these more violent elements of the protest, and I hear so many people say, CIA did not put hundreds of thousands on the street. Of course not. Mm-hmm. But, all you need is to subvert a movement, with a minority of a minority of radicals to push the protest over the edge into an even more violent and more radical direction. And that's exactly what has been happening in Hong Kong. And I even have a Hong Kong journalist contact me on Twitter DM who told me that they were they were part of the 2014 protest. They marched during the initial peaceful protest against the extradition bill, but now they're really concerned about the increasing violence and instability in Hong Kong city itself, because they feel like the situation is getting out of hand and nobody is really controlling these more violent protesters who are out there just vandalizing shops for the heck of just for the heck of destruction. And it just so happens everything dovetails perfectly with the U.S. agenda of creating more trouble in Hong Kong for the Chinese state. I mean, it's you don't even have just look at the result. We don't even have to look at all the $29 million was poured by the NED, and right now, U.S. is undergoing through its own internal problems. We have all known that U.S. has not really quite recovered from the Great Recession of 2009, despite all the economic numbers, all the all-time stock market. But there's still a lot of economic anxiety within the U.S. society. But instead of fixing the problem domestically, our politicians, what they do, they blame Russia, they blame China. China is an existential threat to the American democracy. Like, hell no, like we are the one that's meddling over there. But no, that doesn't matter. People like Marco Rubio, right? Like, rather than focusing on his own state, rather than focusing on the problem in the United States, he is all like about Hong Kong, which I'm sure he really knows nothing about. I mean, that's not what he cares about anyway. He's more caring about basically making a name for himself domestically as this anti-China leader to kind of recover his reputation, that he, when he was exposed for what he really was during the presidential election back in 2016. So he's trying to, basically gain political capital from that. And I see a lot of U.S. politicians are doing that. A lot of U.S. senators are saying, let's stand with Hong Kong. I'm like, no, you know nothing about Hong Kong. You know more about the United States than you do about Hong Kong. And you actually owe a responsibility to the American voters to fix the problem at home than, to like meddle in some places you can't even find on a map, but it's so much easier for politicians just to strike a stance and voice and pass bills than perform the real hard task of actually reforming our own system, which is broken.
When I bring attention to the U.S. hypocrisy over supporting protesters, at this point, a lot of right-wing protesters in Hong Kong, and calling that pro-democracy, while they ignore major fascist coups that in, for instance, Bolivia, it's to point out that there is something else going on that we are not hearing about.
I mean, definitely, because like you already pointed out, during month of protests since June, and sometimes very violent protests in Hong Kong, the number of deaths at the hands of Hong Kong police is zero. I mean, admittedly, that's a low bar, but compared to the protests in Chile, in Bolivia, in Haiti, I mean, where people are being shot and killed, and now there's protests in India as well, where already there has been 6 deaths. But you don't have that overwhelming coverage of Hong Kong, I mean, like you have to wonder why we're not caring about, democracy protests in Chile, in Bolivia, and in India, and why is this like, the overwhelming spotlight is shining on Hong Kong, which is supposedly suffering under this terrible, terrible jackboots,
Hong Kong, along with Ukraine, along with different parts of Syria and, at this point, possibly Bolivia, these different areas where there is kind of a U.S.-backed insurrection of some sort or another become breeding grounds for these right-wing paramilitaries to essentially hone their insurrectionary tactics, to essentially sharpen their own kind of combat or sort of hybrid warfare skills. So this doesn't just have an impact really on Hong Kong and on China, but it also has a ripple effect in that these kind of right-wing paramilitaries then come back not just to the Ukraine, but to the United States, where they can essentially apply these same sort of lessons in how to undergo like a fascist insurrection. And that just it scares me in a lot of ways. If you want to read more, you can check out an article from Ben Norton in the Gray Zone titled "Ukrainian Neo-Nazis Flock to the Hong Kong Protest Movement," that goes into great detail about what we know of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi connection there in Hong Kong. But yeah, I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk about generally like what you've seen with regard to that, like basically like how is this right-wing breeding ground taking place?
Yeah, actually, that's funny because Oslo Freedom Forum, where a lot of the Hong Kong protest opinion leader Joshua Wong and Denise Ho were trained, also trained the Maidan revolutionaries, the people who staged the color revolution in Ukraine, and people who are part of the Syrian rebel group, the so-called Syrian revolution. So all these, they're literally fellow travelers, and they have many of these people were trained together, on how to use social media to spread their message. And in Hong Kong itself, you have NGOs affiliated with the U.S. consulate and the National Endowment for Democracy, doing many film screening of this kind of total propaganda piece, Netflix propaganda piece called Winter on Fire, about the Maidan Revolution, the color revolution in Ukraine, in Hong Kong itself. So they had these massive screening in Hong Kong of the protesters, showing them the Maidan protest. And I remember watching a BBC documentary of this Hong Kong girl, she was crying. She getting really emotional after watching the documentary. And she says, I really hope Hong Kong can also have a happy ending, just like the Ukraine. And I'm thinking, oh my God, do you even know what's happening in Ukraine right now? I mean, there was following the color revolution, there was civil war, there was the rise of neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, and now Azov Battalion is coming to Hong Kong, and it's a really weird mix. Like it's surprising yet not surprising at the same time. And I also want to point out that in the simplified Western narrative painting about Hong Kong, it's often painted as if it's the Hong Kong people versus the big bad Chinese government. But we just actually had the Hong Kong election, the Hong Kong local election, which was held freely, and the so-called pro democracy camp did win a landslide victory, right? Which was also held as an example of the triumph of the protest. So they win about 90% of the vote, 90% of the seats in the Hong Kong district elections. But if you break down actual vote numbers, a different picture emerged, because the Hong Kong system is just like the U.S. Election. It's winner takes all. So whoever wins their district takes the votes. And if you look at the total number of votes, we have about 1.6 million votes for the so-called the pro-protest side, and the 1.2 million votes for the pro-establishment side, right? So that's about 57% versus 42%. So again, the pro Hong Kong establishment votes obviously is not in the majority, but 42% is not is still a significant amount. I mean, it's closer to an even split right now. It's like Hong Kong society is divided on the issues of protests. We have so we still have a slight more majority supporting the protests at 57% among the voter base, but there's that 42% who are against, and their voice has been largely ignored in the Western mainstream media.
I think that's a kind of great place to wrap up the segment. We were joined by Carl Zha, who's the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Thank you very much, Carl, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.